Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, I'm powerless, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, I'm powerless. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you just didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, you might have been powerless as a child, that doesn't mean you'll always be. Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation just as well as your interpretation that I'm powerless? Here's what your second friend says. You might have been powerless around your parents, that doesn't mean you'll be powerless around other people. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm powerless? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. You weren't inherently powerless as a human being. You just didn't have the skills and tools you needed to be able to use your power. When you get older, you'll have communication skills and reasoning skills that will make you powerful. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm powerless? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. As long as your survival depends on someone else, you're powerless around that person, but not around other people. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation, I'm powerless? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not being able to impact your life as a child could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, I'm powerless? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Right now, take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to forming the belief I'm powerless. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see I'm powerless in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief I'm powerless, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When you had to do what your parents wanted and had no say in the matter, didn't it seem as if you saw I'm powerless? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, can't you see I'm powerless? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Now that you think you saw I'm powerless as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see I'm powerless? If you did, what does I'm powerless look like? Could you really point to it? Does I'm powerless have a color, a shape, location? Is it real to you now that you saw events, but never really did see I'm powerless? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I'm powerless looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw I'm powerless, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was your parents telling you what you couldn't do? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was I'm powerless. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you were told what you had to do and had no ability to change the circumstances, it was as if you could see that meaning in those situations. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about what you will have the power to do in the future as a result of these childhood experiences. What do I know for sure about what you'll be able to do when you're an adult, from knowing that your choices were limited as a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. You didn't get what you wanted a lot of the time. And finally, if you never saw I'm powerless out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that I'm powerless has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. Now, if the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel I'm powerless? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel I'm powerless, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if frequently not getting what you wanted as a child couldn't have made you feel I'm powerless, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to frequently not getting what you wanted. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and it helped you realize there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, maybe I am powerless as a child in these circumstances. That doesn't mean I'll always be powerless. So here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child and wanting something badly, and mom and dad tell you you can't have it. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. And really notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, maybe I am powerless in these circumstances as a child. That doesn't mean I'll always be powerless. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel I'm powerless? Probably not. And if you didn't feel I'm powerless then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So mom and dad's comments never caused you to feel I'm powerless. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior and comments. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when you had little or no power to affect your circumstances as a child didn't tell you anything at all about your power to do so when you grew up? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, I'm powerless. Is it the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget, we form beliefs to give meaning to events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events, out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, and that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave the meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Take another deep breath and say, I'm powerless, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true, even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw I'm powerless in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.